Today on our show, we're honored to have world-renowned philosopher and theologian Dr. Peter Kreeft to discuss what a dialogue on the Eucharist between C.S. Lewis, Billy Graham, and J.R.R. Tolkien would sound like. And as always, we've got some great answers to questions in the world of apologetics, so stay tuned. Dr. Kreeft, for the 11 of you listening who don't know, is a professor of philosophy at Boston College. He's a very prolific writer. His books have included, I got to remember, Everything You Wanted to Know About Heaven, but
Never Dreamed of Asking.
Never Dreamed of Asking. Okay, I could, and a bunch of others, including the Handbook of Apologetics. Is that right? The Handbook of Apologetics is yours, and now we have this brand new book from Ignatius Press, "Symbol or Substance: A Dialogue on the Eucharist." And earlier in your career, you wrote what I take to have been a very popular book on a strange thing that happened on the same day. John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, Aldous Huxley, and C.S. Lewis all died on that day.
Same afternoon.
So, really? And so you wrote a book about them meeting and discussing the meaning of life. And this is a similar book, not quite the same. I mean, these are not three men who died on the same day, but this is a meeting that actually could have actually happened in the real world.
It may have happened in the real world because C.S. Lewis and Billy Graham knew and admired each other, and Graham wanted to meet Lewis. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. When he came to England for one of his campaigns, he sent two people ahead to pave the way. They reported back to him that Lewis is... he smokes and he drinks and he swears, but we think he is a Christian. And Graham laughed at that, as you did.
Yeah, that's a great description of. And Lewis was a Christian, and he wrote. I mean, Mere Christianity. I don't know how. That's probably one of the most influential Christian books of the 20th century. It's why many people either stayed Christian or returned to the Christian faith, giving all the assaults on the faith in the 20th century.
It probably made more Christians out of non-Christians than any other book that I know of. And if you talk about a man, other than maybe John Paul II, as far as a man going out and directly preaching the gospel face to face with people, there was probably no more significant figure than Billy Graham in the 20th century. Yeah.
He was it.
Yeah. If the Catholic Church starts canonizing Protestants, he'll be number one.
And that's something he actually. I suppose there's a kind of reputation that TV preachers have, and it's not a good one, frankly. But that's not what he was. It's like maybe a car salesman has a reputation, but that doesn't mean all the car salesmen are bad or something. Right. But or all the lawyers.
Even lawyers.
Well, maybe I don't know. We'll see.
No lawyer jokes here.
Okay, no lawyer jokes. Fair enough. But Billy Graham, in your estimation, was the real deal. This is a man who really believed in Christ and wanted to share him.
Passionately honest, simple, and pious, yes.
Beautiful. And so I don't know why you would put a minor figure like Tolkien in with them. He
minor figure.
What did he do?
He only wrote the greatest book of the century, that's all.
That's the other funny. So all of these guys are the big deals in their century because the Lord of the Rings, to consider nothing else, if you take out on fairy stories and The Hobbit and the many other things that have subsequently come out by Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings itself, many people will, as a matter of fact, people have repeatedly voted it the most important book of the 20th century.
4 different polls. Everyone loves them except the critics.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the critics had their own they had their own problems. They had magazines to sell. So you imagine these three men, C.S. Lewis, Billy Graham, and Tolkien, actually meeting here on this earth, not in the next life as you did in the other book, but here in this life.
I like to be a fly on the wall and listen to conversations between great people. I love Socrates, and I think he lives in the back of my mind somewhere. So I love dialogue. I get bored with monologue. I have ADD. I think that's one of my pluses. I get bored very easily.
Okay.
So I try to write books that aren't boring.
Okay, so and it is dialogue throughout. Like that, I kind of find that I don't know. To me, that's easier to read too. There's something captivating about though. It's a conversation. It's like you're sitting listening to a conversation. Yeah, yeah. And I can remember one of my favorite activities as a kid in the summertime was the adults would be up talking, and you just sit and listen. You could take in so much. It's something fun about listening to a conversation of people who you want to hear from.
Especially if they're arguing with each other,
yeah.
and treating each other as human beings.
This is very polite arguing, I have to say.
It's polite, but it's non-compromising. They're not pop psychologists who are holding each other's hands and singing Kumbaya.
Right.
They're arguing.
Right. They're arguing, and they have Billy Graham's driver is there to help the conversation along as well, to give us kind of, I don't know, the everyman view maybe. None of us are quite in. Maybe you, but not me. We're not.
He's the only one who's a little anti-intellectual and a little anti-Catholic.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Because Graham is not.
No, he's
anti-Catholic.
not. Definitely not.
Wait, you can be a kind of evangelical Catholic.
Well, he's certainly not a Catholic,
No.
but he's not an anti-Catholic either.
Okay.
His view of the Eucharist is basically whatever the Bible says and nothing more. It's sola scriptura. So he doesn't believe in transubstantiation or the Mass or even the Eucharist as sacrifice. But he does believe it's a holy symbol. And Lewis and Graham, at the beginning of the book, argue basically about the real presence.
Yes.
And Lewis, as an Anglican, on the one hand, believes in the real presence.
Right.
So he's with the Catholics. On the other hand, he's not a Catholic, and he wants to mediate between transubstantiation, which he doesn't understand, and Graham's view, which is only a symbol, which Lewis did not agree with.
Right. I was very... Of the three of them, I found Billy Graham the most interesting, frankly, because I didn't know that theology of the Eucharist. But when he says, do you believe in the real presence? Billy Graham is able to say, yes, I believe in the real presence, because this is a symbol that brings us closer to Christ, essentially.
Yeah, it's no more than the Bible is the real presence. It's the presence in the soul, not the objective presence in the elements that he believes in.
Fair enough. Okay, so let me ask you this, though. And by the way, if you're a caller, you are welcome to call if you'd like to talk with Dr. Peter Kreeft, 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884. I'm saying Kreeft correctly, am I?
That's right.
Okay.
It's Dutch. It means
Dutch.
lobster.
It means lobster, really?
Yeah.
They made a movie about you recently.
Since Peter means rock, I'm a rock lobster. I'm edible.
Can we get that song up? No, we better not. We don't have to pay the royalty. Okay, so it struck me that there are many things that these men could have and might have well have spoken about. You chose the Eucharist as the locus of this conversation. Why?
Well, I know enough about Reformation history to realize that that was the issue between Protestants and Catholics that was the fieriest. For instance, Luther and Zwingli each called each other demon-possessed or devil-inspired because they had contrasting views on the Eucharist. The issue is very divisive. Somebody's very wrong. If Christ is really fully body and blood, soul and divinity present in the Eucharist, as Catholics believe, then Protestants are missing out on the greatest opportunity in human life.
Right.
The complete package. The Eucharist is to the Catholic religion what sexual intercourse is to marriage. It's the consummation.
Yes.
If, on the other hand, they're wrong, they're the most ridiculous and stupid idolaters in the history of the world. They're worshiping wine and bowing down to bread, thinking it's Almighty God.
Right. Okay. So you get this one right, then you've gotten Christianity right. If you get, or a better way to say it, maybe if you get it wrong, you've gotten Christianity wrong, or either you're missing out on the most important heart of the Christian faith, or you're worshiping bread.
And despite that enormous gap between the two sides, these three people recognize that all three of them love Christ, are devoted, honest, pious, passionate Christians, have a lot in common, and respect each other.
There seems to be some concern about some of the statements that Pope Francis seems to make at times, and it seems to be confusing to the laity, myself included, being a cradle Catholic. Some of the things he said recently about about atheists being able to get into heaven, whereas that's not the dogma, I believe, of the Church. It's just it's very difficult to understand and he doesn't seem to clarify when asked a lot of times, and so there seems to be a confusion out there.
Okay. All right. So, Chris, I think, first of all, I don't know exactly which particular statement that you're referring to from Pope Francis. So I can't comment explicitly on that. But I can comment on the principle itself concerning what does the Church teach about individuals outside the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church and the possibility of them attaining heaven. So I can comment on that. But before I do that, you threw in sort of a third aspect there concerning possible confusion that arises from some of the Pope's statements and maybe perhaps his lack of clarity and lack of clarification subsequent to statements that he makes. And that's fine. I mean, that's something that, across the board, Catholics can be a bit frustrated with and say, Holy Father, come on, man, give us some clarity here. And that's perfectly legitimate, right?
Yeah.
And I would agree with you, Chris, that, hey, there's some things I would like for him to clarify and just give us a little clarification on. So there's nothing wrong with that. But concerning the actual principle of, can someone outside the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church receive the grace of salvation? And the fundamental answer to that question is yes. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone outside the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church is automatically going to heaven, right? It's not suggesting a religious indifferentism and that being Catholic doesn't matter.
Right.
That's not what it's suggesting. What it is teaching, what the Church does teach, for example, in paragraph 1260 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and I think it's referencing Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council, that the Holy Spirit offers to all the possibility of being made partakers in a way known to God of the Paschal mystery. And then it goes on to give certain conditions. Every man who is ignorant of the gospel of Christ and of his church. And that's referring to an invincible ignorance. Someone who's ignorant of the revelation of Christ and his church, but is not responsible or not culpable for that ignorance. The Catechism goes on to state, but seeks that individual, but nevertheless seeks the truth and does the will of God in accordance with his understanding of it, can be saved, right? And then it goes on to articulate this concept of implicit desire for baptism, which St. Thomas Aquinas articulates. Pope Pius XII taught it in Mystici Corporis, right, the mystical body of Christ, that God knows the hearts of individuals. And God knows that if the revelation of Jesus Christ and the sacrament of baptism would have been revealed to this individual, then they would have embraced it, right? And so it is possible for an individual outside the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church to receive the grace of salvation, precisely because, Chris, as the Catechism points out in paragraph 1257, God is not bound by his sacraments. He binds us to the sacraments in ordinary circumstances, those to whom it is revealed. But God is not bound by the sacraments. He can work outside the visible boundaries of the sacraments and administer the grace of salvation to individuals who are not responsible for their ignorance, etc. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't matter to be Catholic, because as the doctrinal note on evangelization from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 2007 states that within the Catholic Church, because the fullness of grace and truth subsists within the Catholic Church, it is objectively speaking, a great good that God wills for all people to have. And that provides for us, you might say, an easier path by which we can attain salvation and persevere into the end, because we have all the truth and all the grace. So we have all the equipment needed, right, that Christ wills for us to have to attain our final end of salvation. But at the same time, it is possible for people outside the visible boundaries to be saved.
Yeah, so my question has to do with defending the faith when looking at the situation where you have public figures that claim to be Catholic or tout their Catholic faith, for example, Governor Cuomo of New York, and then does things that are so violent to the Catholic faith, and by canon law 919 should be ipso facto excommunicated or at least deny communion, but yet Cardinal Dolan said it was inappropriate to talk about excommunication. How do you defend the faith when that stuff is out there and it's not being addressed from the leadership. In fact, it's being brushed off. When you consider back in the 60s, you had a racist politician. He got excommunicated down in the South because it was incompatible with the faith. But we're supporting infanticide, and that's not a grounds for excommunication.
Sure.
How do you defend that when people bring up, "Oh, these are your people"?
Sure. Well, first, Matthew, I would say that when it comes to the issue of excommunication, the procedures and grounds for excommunication are rooted in the code of canon law. And so you would have to look to how canon lawyers interpret excommunicating people. I actually covered this a little bit in my own podcast at trenthornpodcast.com, so you can see my episode on excommunication. And I did a recent one actually on Governor Cuomo and on these almost, essentially infanticide laws, these abortion laws that allow abortion right up until the moment of birth. So even if someone cannot be technically excommunicated, I firmly agree with you that as Catholics, we should be vocally opposed to those who would deny the right to life of unborn human beings and adamantly speak out against that and not be mealy-mouthed. And so I think that, Matthew, sometimes, the Psalms, in the book of Psalms in the Old Testament, it says, "Put not your trust in princes." And generally what that would mean is, don't expect politicians to solve all your problems. And that's something we should be used to by now. Or leaders. Only God can ultimately save us from what threatens us most. But the cardinals are also called princes. They're princes of the church. And so while we look to bishops and the magisterium to lead us and teach us authoritatively, sometimes they may not be morally courageous when the situation requires it. But just because other Catholics are not making a stand doesn't mean that we shouldn't. I think that we just have to, regardless of what anybody else is doing. It reminds me in the early church when Saint Athanasius in the Eastern Empire of the Church, it was overrun with the Arian heresy, and so there was an old Latin phrase, Athanasius contra mundum, that in that part of the empire it was Athanasius against the world, but he stood resolutely, and Arianism was defeated, and we shouldn't give in just because others have. We still have to stand strong with that. So I'm trying to give some bit of a reinforcement here, but do you see where I'm saying that, ultimately the only thing we can control is us, and we can tell people, hey, there's in every belief system, there's people who don't live up to the code, but this is what the truth is. Do you want to accept that or not? I don't know. What do you think of that?
I understand that, and I really do, but yet I'm just trying to figure out if the church talks about being courageous on a whole lot of issues that have a whole lot less to do with, life and death. Well, and yes, they have that as their official teaching.
Well, what do you mean, Matthew? What do you mean exactly?
Oh, Iowa 2016 election, you had the bishop's voting guide for the bishops of Iowa, and it was, weak is an understatement. It listed things like school choice on the same list as defending life. Like, these are all equal platform issues. You pick and choose, and you should kind of consider all of them. I mean,
right. Well, one thing I would say is that it's important for people to know, and any voting guide that does not say this would be ambiguous or misleading, and there should be a correction. Not all issues have equal weight, and not all issues can be approached equally. Some moral issues are non-negotiable. Like when it comes to abortion, I'm sorry, it's the killing of a human being. You can't make it legal to kill these human beings just because they are unwanted. You can't reasonably disagree about that. I'm not going to agree to disagree with somebody on that issue. The same thing goes to religious freedom, that we have the freedom to raise our children in the faith, and government can't take that away from us. That's another non-negotiable issue. So I don't know if that, when they say school choice, it falls under that. But the ability to have vouchers, minimum wage increases, a lot of these other public policy proposals fall under the scope of prudential judgment, that we have to use reason to arrive at a conclusion that has not been definitively taught by the magisterium. And because of that, Catholics can reasonably disagree with one another. Also, those voting guides might include a lot of issues. Like, let's say you have respect for life. okay, you've got two candidates who both are pro-life. One supports school choice, so people can go to Catholic schools and have assistance to do that, and another does not. There, the lesser issue of school choice might kind of tip the balance if you have, for example, two pro-life candidates. So that's something we also have to consider with these issues. You could have people that agree on major issues, or in some cases, you're voting for the lesser of two evils. You have two pro-choice candidates. You got to just pick the one that endorses the least amount of evils. You can also go to our website at Catholic.com for more voting guide tips and other things like that as well. But I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So, are we overworked?
Yeah, I think there is a sense that for a lot of folks, we are overworked. But I think we have multiple problems with it. In one hand, in one sense, we undervalue work. We sometimes look at work, it lacks any intrinsic value, and all we can get out of it is kind of an extrinsic value. We simply look at it as money. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and this guy in Chicago, a columnist, his name is Mike Royko.
I remember Mike.
Remember Mike Royko?
Work.
Yes, exactly. And he had always a great line. He says, listen, if work is so great, how come they have to pay us to do it? You know?
Yeah.
And so this idea that work is simply extrinsic. That's one problem. And yet that's kind of maybe one ditch. On the other ditch, for, two ditches on the road, the other ditch is that we overvalue work. We try to get more out of it than what it is, and we try to get our identity out of it.
Right.
And so the idea, particularly a Catholic idea of work, is that we have to be careful of undervaluing it because we're called to work. And yet we also have to be mindful of the fact that we overvalue it. We make it kind of, it's almost idolatrous. This is always the problem of idolatry.
Yeah.
You make second things primary.
Right. Okay.
And so I think, there's multiple problems with work, but that would be two ways to describe it.
Do you think that there was a time maybe in the period of Christendom where, in the guilds and all of that, which we're taught now to be very dismissive of, do you think there was a better balance in those days, or?
Yeah, I think it was certainly more organic. It's interesting. The word economics comes from a Greek word that is defined as management of the household. And prior to the Industrial Revolution, right, work was placed where? It was placed in the home. That's why it's management of the household.
Oh, yes, right.
So our economic production occurred within the household. And it's precisely in that environment that a more kind of more organic, more integral kind of way of looking at things. It doesn't mean they didn't have problems. They had lots of dysfunctions. There's no kind of golden age here and things that's right. But what happens after the Industrial Revolution, we took work out of the household and we placed it in corporations. And thus we looked at work purely on these kind of often extrinsic dimensions, only in terms of efficiency, productivity, profitability.
Right.
And thus we say that's what work's about, right? But that is a kind of a distortion of work. Now, this doesn't mean we have to go back to the, pre-industrial ages, but it's an idea that we have come into an era that has caused some problems. And the more we can think about it, the more we can kind of recognize some of the trappings that we find ourselves in.
Would you say that part of the difficulty is maybe of this misunderstanding or this kind of misvaluing of work is... I want to say that on one side, we have a general misvaluing of the human person in the modern period, but also there's just the very practical idea that work has become highly specialized in the modern era in a way that it never was before. I mean, very highly specialized. So you work on one part of a computer program if you're a programmer, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And I do think that's been part of the problem of industrialization, kind of the cog in the wheel. Even someone like a Karl Marx kind of recognized that we become alienated from our labor from those things. Now, Marx had a highly materialistic view of the world, and he kind of distorted that aspect. That's why John Paul, actually in Centesimus Annus, when he wrote that encyclical in 1991, talked about alienation. But he talked about it in terms of a reversal of means and ends, right?
Okay.
And so what happens, as you mentioned, in this highly specialized world that we find ourselves, we're focused on means, and we've lost sight of the end. And that causes a kind of a reversal of things that causes a disorder of things. And thus, for example, in corporate America, if you look at publicly traded companies, you still find in the in financial ways of looking at things, that the purpose of this company is to maximize shareholder wealth, right? It's to maximize profit. But as Benedict says, profit is a means, not an end. It's a great servant, but it's a lousy master. And thus, we run into these challenges that we've disordered it. We've disordered the means and ends relationship. We make things that are secondary primary, and we turn them into slogans, and we don't even know that that's becoming it becomes a trapping. Mm-hmm. And then we wonder, how did we get here, right? How do we find ourselves in this predicament? Why is work sucking the life out of me? Why is work, and yet I feel somewhat, connected to it, but not connected to it.
Well, so this specialization then is not the root problem. You could have a highly specialized economy if you had a proper understanding of ends and means.
Exactly, I think that's right. And this is where the book we've been running around. The book's coming out next month, and we've been running around in terms of the title. And one of the people in the marketing department from Emmaus Road, which is coming out of that publication, said she liked that phrase I use in the book called "getting work right." So here's the thesis of the book, and it's a thesis. I think it actually comes not all the things that I write is coming out of the Catholic tradition. This comes from a man named Joseph Pieper, who wrote a book called "Leisure: The Basis of Culture," and the thesis of the book is that we will never get work right unless we get leisure right. Okay, or rest right, and this is where the fundamental sense of the ends come about. Not from work, but from leisure.
So you're saying that there's supposed to be rest in this life? We're supposed to actually get rest while we're here. We're not just supposed to work ourselves to death and then rest.
Exactly. Right. The book of Genesis.
That's un-American.
There you go.
Say.
If you look at the book of Genesis, right, we're not only made to work, we're made to rest.
Okay.
And here's you started off this interview with the idea of balance.
Yeah.
And the problem with balance, we think balance is going to solve our problems. And, there's a role for balance. There's no doubt about it. But it's an overused word, particularly in this country. What balance will do in this realm, I got work over here, I got leisure over here, I just got to balance it and I'll be okay. No, that creates what we call the divided life. It actually, it doesn't confront it, it avoids it. And so the balanced life often leads to a division. It doesn't lead to a kind of proper relationship about ends and means. Mm-hmm. Because we divided them, we balance them, but we don't connect them.
Thanks for watching Catholic Answers Live TV. Join us each weekday from 3 to 5 Pacific and 6 to 8 Eastern for our live radio broadcast on EWTN Radio. Or join us on the EWTN app. Find more videos and live streams on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/CatholicCom, or find us on Facebook simply by searching Catholic Answers. Jesus Christ is the light of the nations, and we'll see you next week on Catholic Answers Live TV.